Ross, I might start off here with a little interesting experience that we've had, unlike no other guest I've interviewed before. And that is, you're the first guest that I've actually ever competed against in a competitive situation. We were both long jumpers. Your coaching career has taken off a little more than mine, but yeah, that's an interesting fact you pulled up the other day. I had actually forgotten that completely, but I remember following you a few years ago and recognizing your name from somewhere. Um, so yeah, I suppose start with me about your long jumping career first, and then how you bled into where you are now, which is obviously in a very nice situation over in Qatar.
Yeah, sure, no worries. I remember that competition quite vividly, actually, in Grangemouth. I think none of us took the win that day, but it was a very good competition, and we both jumped relatively well. Yeah, my jumps career, I started off as a high jumper at a very young age, and then I dabbled with the other jump events, and I was quite typically your jumper that wasn't really progressing how we'd like. And then that's when I started kind of diving into a lot of the material out there on the internet at that point. You had Elite Track Forum and the Charlie Francis Forum, which was kind of a hotbed of information at that time. And I ended up being like self-coached from a pretty early age, trying to figure out stuff. And then it just evolved naturally into a coaching career where, athletes and coaches were kind of leaning on some of my knowledge, which wasn't experienced at that point. And then once I graduated from the University of Bath in sport and exercise science, I then started coaching first in Jersey, and then I moved to London working with Jonas Dodoo at Speedworks, and then I moved to the Netherlands where I spent time as sprints and jumps coach at the regional training center in Rotterdam. And then I finally made my way out here to Aspire. For the first 3 years, I worked as a sprints and hurdles coach at Aspire. And then for the past 3 years, I've been the lead jumps and combined events coach, and I'm coming up to my seventh year now. And my main role is oversee the direction of the program and also work closely with the Qatar Athletics Federation to support the progression of athletes in these event groups from youth to senior level. My main coaching focus is currently on an elite triple jump group where we've had an athlete who's had a top 10 jump for the past 3 years at junior level.
Unreal, yeah. It certainly looks like a nice opportunity, and I know one of my former guests, Luis, is now a part of your support staff, which is, I suppose, a testament to the type of investment that Qatar is making in track and field, which again is brilliant. And I actually had a guest um, recently on, Jack Green, who's just joined the Team Saudi for long sprints and hurdles. So again, like just a lot of those countries doing a great amount of work, and it's nice to see because as they're probably seeing now, your expertise is contributing towards the next crop of jumpers coming through. So we're going to dive into a lot of the, I suppose, concepts that you and I have exchanged over the last few weeks, and I really enjoyed picking your brains on some of these things. Particularly, we'll start with the categorization of athletes, and I think in some senses these will be relatively familiar to what has been put out there by other practitioners in the past, but you actually have some very unique additions to these types of categories. So, how about start off by explaining what your categories of athlete are? And I suppose this translates from sprints, hurdles, right across the jump. So you've seen a wide degree of these categories play out. And then I suppose, yeah, we'll go in deeper after that.
Okay, cool, no problem. Yeah, I'll try and unpack some of those ideas. If people want like a lot of detail on that I go a bit deeper into some other in some other presentations and podcasts on the Just Fly Performance podcast or the LTAD network. But the basic premise is we know idiosyncrasies exist in sprinting, and while technical models are important, they can sometimes force athletes into a mold that actually takes away from their natural gifts. And we also know that different athletes respond differently to training. So some athletes thrive off a high force, strength dominant methods, others with more elastic and reactive work, and others with larger running volumes and rhythm-based approaches. And kind of that's where it started for me. And broadly speaking, I tend to see like three distinct types, as you said, for sprinting anyway. First, the more concentric dominant athlete. They usually excel in their acceleration abilities. They tend to have superior explosive strength qualities. They tend to be more contractile in nature and rely heavily on the anterior chain musculature for force production. And then you have the more elastic athlete who tend to dominate max velocity. These athletes are naturally gifted at recycling energy through the foot and ankle complex and tend to have superior stiffness and shorter ground contact times, and usually rely more on elastic return rather than brute force production. And finally, there's what I'd call the metabolic athlete. These athletes who dominate the back end of races because of their superior ability to manage and sustain speed through highly efficient energy system interaction. And they work better using both kind of non-contractile and contractile elements. And in terms of how you train them, like I said, there's a bit more detail out there, but it's just about feeding their strengths at the right time. And now I'm doing a bit more work in the jumps. I think the difference is max velocity in the jumps is not the only KPI, as it isn't maybe sprinting. It's in these events, it's not necessarily sprint typing, but it's maybe long jump typing or triple jump typing. We're talking about a physical capacity that is a combination of speed and a very specific type of reactive strength. So in the long jump, you probably have your like concentric or power jumpers, to use like elite male examples. You probably call that like a Rutherford. And you have the elastic side, which is maybe like someone like an Irving Saladino.
Mm-hmm.
And then the speed side, you have like a Carl Lewis, to use extreme examples. In the triple jump, probably have like your power or concentric jumpers, like your Zango or your Napolis from Cuba. And then you have the more elastic jumpers, your Jordan Diaz, your Pichardo. And then you have like a speed type, which is probably like your Christian Taylors and your Jonathan Edwards. And you can see the difference in terms of how long they spend on the ground and the distribution of distance in each phase and how they're able to carry the speed through the phases.
Mm. Yeah, and I think it's important to probably note that when you're at the elite level, you kind of have a bit of everything. And what I'm hearing you say is more so like where they sit on the continuum of any one of those things. Like it is primarily towards elasticity, although they also are. Jonathan Edwards was, able to clean 150 kilos, which means he's able to produce a lot of force too. Um, I suppose the metabolic category is one that I really hadn't heard before. And to be honest with you, I probably resonated with it a lot given my own athletic career. Someone who, like as much as I read and as much as I delved into the likes of elasticity and power and tried both of those on at various stages, I just never felt like I belonged in any one of those. Because I was neither really. I could, maybe lift heavy with a lot of training. Elasticity seemed like something fairly genetic for the most part, or at least had a ceiling that would cap out quite early. But the metabolic, you talked about in previous posts and, as you said, other forums, that this is kind of where you exploit volume. This is where smoothness and rhythm is kind of a focal point of how that athlete moves, and that backside mechanics, albeit in today's world of maybe posting track and field content is somewhat unpopular, that they're actually very important for leveraging the type of strengths that the athlete has as well. And I found that particularly interesting because I myself probably went down the front side rabbit hole for a while and got slower. It felt like I was moving on the spot. So what I'm hearing you say is that like actually, for a certain type of athlete, that's an essential movement strategy, really.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, like in terms of your observations around metabolic, I think maybe historically throughout the UK and probably our observations at club level, you see a lot of these athletes just because they're often bred from a running based training program. And this is changing a bit now, but you see those athletes improve considerably throughout age groups, and they can become elite athletes. And I think elite coaching is where like you mentioned, you can kind of clean that up. So like being metabolic is about athletes who like to pull themselves forward. Like you can still do that with really big ranges of motion at front side in front of you. But to get that right, you need to still be really stiff on the ground so you don't have too much behind you. But I think the difference is if you try and be front side and you try and maybe your hips are slightly too high and there's maybe too much bounce, you're probably not going to be able to use that pulling mechanism, which is what those metabolic athletes really feed of their, to use the oldest categories, they're certainly pullers. And I think that's the challenge of elite coaching, right? It's, can you balance an athlete's natural strength with what is biomechanically more efficient or sustainable?
Mm. And I suppose this is getting into the complex part of coaching a little bit, in that, do you kind of believe that these categories are defined by genetics and or pre-existing training? And I suppose, do you also believe that, over time, anyone can kind of become a little bit more nudged over to the other side of a different continuum? I guess what I mean is, if you were to, enhance someone's max strength category or capabilities and force production and all that, and within resisted sprinting, you know, could they over time become a little bit more that way inclined? I guess that's
Yeah.
a way to say it.
Yeah, I don't think athletes ever completely change their underlying disposition. I think a concentric athlete will probably always retain concentric tendencies, and an elastic athlete will always heavily rely on reactive qualities. But what great coaching can do is develop weaknesses to a point where the athlete becomes more complete and well-rounded, as you said. And like you mentioned with Jonathan Edwards, like at the elite level, you're probably not going to notice as much what type of athlete they are, because maybe they have this really superior quality, but the other qualities are higher than you would have, a sub-elite level. So I think the danger comes when coaches try and completely overwrite an athlete's natural solution to jumping or sprinting and force them too far towards an ideal technical model or physical profile that doesn't suit their underlying profile.
Mm. And I think where that happens is where you kind of see not just a, small short-term decrease in performance, but quite a large one, I would say, is because they're trying to coordinate something that's so unfamiliar that they kind of lose an essence of what it means to express intent at the level that they were used to. Would you say that's somewhat accurate?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
So next thing I want to kind of move on to is, you've mentioned before, like, that, you're in Qatar and carrying out various forms of testing to assess physical readiness through the training process, or perhaps even not just physical readiness, but to track how a mesocycle has happened, and all the rest of it. And you've come up with some interesting solutions. So I'm interested to hear with the jump testing side of things, what's kind of been developing on your end.
Yeah, it feeds in nicely from some of the typing stuff, where you can really understand an athlete's movement strategies and their capacities. And I've explored a wide range of both performance and fatigue management monitoring tools over the past 15 years or so. And, counter movement jumps, depth jumps, 10-5 and 1-1. We've used my jump, opto jump, force plates, and also used internal tools like Omega Wave and Whoop. And when Rob Miller came in to Aspire from British Athletics, he introduced the idea of primarily focusing on relative peak power output during a counter movement jump on force plates, rather than solely relying on more traditional metrics like jump height. And this has been a game changer for me in terms of injury prevention, fatigue monitoring, and also performance prediction. It's by far the most sensitive tool I've used, not just for detecting fatigue, but also tracking intra-athlete performance trends in sprint and jump events. And, every time an athlete's PB'd from a peak power output perspective, they also like PB in a competition like clockwork. It's been pretty fascinating and unexpected to observe, to be honest. But I think to get the most out of this test, you have to be pretty specific on the execution. And I've modified the execution a little bit compared to other practitioners. And I think that's really important. If the goal is to maximize your relative peak power output, the strategy of the jump changes dramatically to a counter movement jump performed for maximal jump height. And I found that a very shallow counter movement jump, typically in the range of 10 to 20 centimeters, with a maximal intent to jump high in that shallow range, tends to produce the highest relative peak power output values. And I think a large part of that is because the short ranges of motion allow you to have higher vertical ground reaction force and also higher center of mass velocities. So the system starts behaving more like a spring, and you make greater use of the stretch shortening cycle. and the jump becomes less dependent on slower contractile or muscular contributions and more dependent on CNS-driven mechanisms. So small changes in readiness tend to show up a bit clearer in the data. So effectively, we're using the CMJ to observe systems, what you'd probably see more in drop jumps and reactive strength tests. But for me, with much better reliability and validity, like with drop jumps and 10-5, they're really valuable, but they're heavily influenced by how you step off the box, your stiffness strategy, your landing mechanics, your contact time variability. And the shallow CMJ sits really nicely in the middle ground. It's reactive enough to be highly sensitive to CNS and neuromuscular fatigue, but also stable and repeatable enough to provide very consistent day-to-day monitoring. And I think if you want to look at jump height, because one, you're interested in explosive jump capabilities or explosive strength capabilities, and two, you still think it's valuable for fatigue monitoring, I think you have to do a CMJ solely based on execution for jump height, or you just get stuck in this middle ground of around like a 20 to 30 centimeter kind of movement depth that's trying to maximize peak power output and jump height, and you're probably not telling a true story for either of them.
Mm. And with monitoring the actual amount of drop, is that done through the valve decks or some sort of decks that you have? Or also, if you say didn't have that kind of software or ability to track the depth, how might a coach kind of monitor that more closely if they had a less, let's say, expensive piece of software or something that's a bit more like the My Jump or something like that?
Yeah, I don't know at that point in time because I'm lucky enough to have my own set of valve force plates that I can access on a daily basis. But I'm sure if I get to that point in my career where I don't have that anymore, I'll come back to you. But right now, I'm just lucky enough to have that to work with.
And so they do give you a metric on exactly how much one drops their hips.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly.
And do
Can
you
and you
find,
can yeah,
sorry, go on.
you can customize those metrics to, so on my dashboard, as soon as they do a jump, I see how far they lowered and I see their relative peak power output, and I can put in other metrics if I'm trying to investigate something. I still might keep jump height there to have a look at it and how it's behaving, but yeah, mainly focus on those two metrics.
Nice. And have you found through just regular execution of that test that that in a way not only is providing you, I suppose, a metric for physiological readiness, but you mentioned that executing it in that manner kind of, I suppose, utilizes the stretch shortening cycle a little bit more. Do you find that like that is a good actual training stimulus as well for people that aren't maybe relying on that enough and they are maybe, prone to going down and using the slower, kind of more muscular side of things, if you get what I'm saying?
Do you rephrase that a little bit, if that's all right?
So do you find that like cueing them to go down very shallow is actually a good way to allow them to tap into more of those elastic qualities just as a training stimulus, and you kind of see that change in the athlete over time where yes, their numbers are going up, you're getting your assessment of if they're improving, but also you're seeing them begin to leverage that stretch shortening cycle
Yeah,
that much
yeah,
better, if that makes sense.
yeah, I'm with you. Yeah, the skill of being able to do that, like when we first get them on the platforms, when they first join the program, like they can go in that range, but um, there's one kid we had that's jump, like I think his best is 101 relative peak power output, and he started and he was around, I think 70, 80, and still in that range, but he just couldn't figure out. And I think maybe a bit, probably after a month of familiarization, he started to figure out this is how I produce. And doing that, 2 or 3 times a week, it is a skill in itself, and it's gonna create movement solutions and help them figure out how to use their elastic abilities in many different tasks. So sure, I think you're getting some skill transfer from that as well.
Mm, yeah. So we'll go a little bit into the hamstring rehabilitation side. I know obviously you're a triple jump coach and we'll spend a lot more time talking about that. But you've also mentioned just in our exchanges that you've kind of figured out a pretty good way to, I suppose, assess and prevent hamstring injuries across the board within your group. So I'm interested to hear more about that because I think, no matter what type of coaches listen to this, hamstring injuries are something that they deal with a lot, and we actually don't talk about a lot on the podcast. So I'd be interested to get your thoughts on it.
Yeah, sure. Despite generally having like a pretty strong injury record with regards to hamstring injury in my coaching career, I still see the occasional hamstring injury every couple of years, probably across a decade of coaching. But when I started coaching triple jumpers 3 years ago, we had like two really bad 3C hamstring injuries that kind of forced me to reassess my approach a bit. And since making those changes for the athletes who've fully followed my system, we've gone almost two systems without having a hamstring injury issue. And that's even with athletes who've had some pretty extensive hamstring injury histories. Um, and previously, my approach was kind of to heavily load the hamstrings in the GPP, continue fairly aggressively loading them through SPP, and then in pre-comp and in season, maybe just a dose of eccentric work, maybe once a week. And this worked reasonably well with sprinters, but with jumpers and especially triple jumpers, like the combination of one, running fast, two, like extreme ranges of motion and high lengthening velocities during the hop phase, and then repeated spinal compression from high force contacts. I think that just made the total stress excessive. And now instead, I'll still develop the hamstrings really push that in the GPP for the first 2 months in September and October, for basically 6 to 8 weeks of trying to create some big architectural changes in both the muscle and tendon. And then we'll just ride that through the season. And once we transition to high speed sprinting and jumping, we pretty much remove all direct hamstring specific loading, like nothing. And then I won't revisit that again until September the following year. I found athletes generally probably need around 2 weeks clear of like really heavy specific hamstring work before you can get away with sprinting fast. So like any of the disc coordination or residual fatigue in the hammies has gone by then. So I don't think, the hamstring exercises are inherently bad, but what I underestimated before was just the sheer amount of elite sprinting and jumping, placed on the hamstring. And now we know from the research, it's shown us that we can get, pretty similar adaptations in the hamstring to sprinting as we do through eccentric exercise. And at the same time, removing direct hamstring exercises doesn't mean the hamstrings aren't being loaded. Like we're still loading them indirectly through squatting, lunging, Olympic lift variations, other compound lower body movements. But the difference is that these exercises expose the hamstring to much lower lengthening velocities and lower isolated strain than direct eccentric or isometric work. So rather than removing the stimulus entirely, we just simply remove like redundant high strain loading. And I think, the hamstring muscle is very different from the other muscles. Like if we take the calf, for example, we're still loading the calf like very directly in the gym and in season, but that's a muscle that's more, tendon driven, probably has a lower percentage of fast twitch fibers. So inherently, it's just very different architecturally in the hamstring. So maybe that's why we can get away of loading those kind of muscles in season. And I think, as Boo says, Nordics are the cause of the disease, not the part of the cure. And it's obviously a provocative statement, but I think it holds a lot of weight. And I understand the principle that sometimes the solution to a loading problem isn't more loading. And I think that's where maybe a lot of practitioners are getting it wrong. And I think even in team sports, this applies. I did some consultancy work with the Aussie women's sevens team a few years ago, and their head of performance, Tom Carter, didn't do any eccentric hamstring exercises, and it did a huge volume of running and high speed meters. But he had an incredible record of hamstring injuries. I think he only had like 2 or 3 in 6 years. From a team sport perspective, that's pretty impressive.
That is very impressive, definitely. And it is so interesting that we've got to the point now where we're kind of nearly circling back around to going to no loading, whereas it seemed like, and this is just from my observation of being, in sports performance circles and watching online, that there was nearly an obsession with loading the hamstrings to prevent injury. And obviously the Nordics were at the forefront of that. But I think people are realizing that, less can be more. And obviously, the dose and when you kind of do it matched with the other capacities that you're trying to address is actually the key in a lot of cases. Now, is it more complicated than that? There's certainly a lot of complexity to the hamstring, and some brilliant podcasts out there like Adam Murdoch talking about those things that are very, very worth considering. But yeah, from a training prescription standpoint, some really great points there. I'm interested to know, you said you still do aggressively load it during the first 6 to 8 weeks of general prep. Is that still from an injury prevention standpoint, or should I say, is it purely from an injury prevention standpoint, or do you feel like, well, given that we are, trying to build somewhat of a base here for performance, it's actually fairly essential as well?
Yeah, I think that's maybe where I got too obsessed in the past, because I think, the hamstring is a prime mover for, and it's a KPI for sprint performance. I think one of, was it JB's work that showed that the hamstring muscle was pretty responsible for, actual performance in sprinting. And I think I tried to push that maybe to the max. And that's where I got into problems. And I think in that GPP, I'm doing that for two reasons. One, to get some, big architectural changes for injury prevention, but two, also build a base that then we can, like any typical periodization scheme, you're developing a capacity of something that then you can use and transfer into something later down the line. And I think that's where I've gone with now. And I think, the same way we talked about the hamstrings are being loaded indirectly in the gym, we're loading the hamstrings indirectly in, a lot of plyometrics and hopping and bounding that we're doing as well as sprinting. So
Hmm.
that's almost your specific hamstring work, so to speak.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think I probably mention Stu McMillan on every podcast that I do, but he does have some really good nuggets on, probably these very, very heavily debated slash, yeah, popular topics and concepts, and finds a way to summarize, issues that go on within them. So I've seen him do a presentation before on hamstring rehabilitation in team sports. As you mentioned, it's a particularly prevalent, problem. And he talks about, coordination oftentimes being the missing link between, coming back to full training or competition. Because, yeah, those drills that you're talking about there could be a straight leg bound, could be an ankle dribble, is allowing I want to say the computer to reboot, but, kind of connecting the dots within the nervous system, within all of the muscle above and below the area. So I find it very interesting. I think, thankfully, like, the likes of Stu now are popularizing those kind of concepts, and probably producing, helping people produce better results with the rehab. I think it's time we move on to a bit of triple jump, Ross. So,
Sure.
you'd mentioned the beginning, obviously being a jumper, someone who is clearly very curious from the very early parts of your career. But I'm interested to know more specifically, outside of the forums that you've kind of explored yourself. You've worked with Jonas, you coach in the Netherlands, but who are your kind of main influences? And this can be, someone that's been an indirect mentor from looking online, or people you've actually met in real life, that really shape your philosophy. Because, you're British, you're someone who's now working in Qatar. It's not like you've come through the NCAA system, so you probably have potentially a different set of influences to the most of the coaches that I may get on here.
Yeah, yeah, it's a fair point. I think, like a lot of people, the first stuff I was exposed to was, stuff on those kind of forums I mentioned before, from Dan Paff, from Bushek Snyder. Those kind of guys really, built the base of my knowledge. And then at university, I had a really good triple jump coach, Paul Weston, who really understood the triple jump event and helped me really understand the feel of the event. And then, since maybe specializing in the triple jump a few years ago, I've had some really good mentors, online that have been helping me, like Keith Hurston, Jeremy Fisher, Randy Huntington, and also, Aaron Gadsden's helped a bit as well. And I think the beauty of being in Qatar is that you get exposed to like coaching methodologies you wouldn't from every other part of the world, like North African, South African, Eastern European, Cuban. And like I said, I think the internet's been incredible for coach education as well as my own early learning. But I think a lot of what's been popularized over the last 10 to 15 years has largely come through maybe the lens of, strength and conditioning, sprint performance, or like English speaking coaches. Um, so I think that's really helped those events. 15 years ago, coaches weren't discussing biomechanics, front side, wicket runs, year round speed exposure. And you see Dan Paff's fingerprint on every program. The evolution's been hugely positive, particularly in the sprint events. And, athletes are probably more prepared, better monitored, and mechanically cleaner than ever before, but I'm not sure the jump events have evolved to the same extent. And that's kind of what I've really been starting to figure out with the triple jump. And probably, I think if you look historically over the last 30 or 40 years outside of America, and maybe those American coaches I mentioned, countries like Cuba and the old Soviet Union, Eastern Bloc nations stand out. And, compared to modern sprint methodology, there's actually, very little accessible information on how those systems are truly developed, and a lot of knowledge that hasn't been passed on through mentors or been lost or never translated properly or just never widely disseminated in the English coaching world. And, just look at Bondarchuk, like one of the most influential training methodologies in athletics and throws. And it really only happened because a Soviet coach ended up in Derek Evely's basement, and Derek was so committed on translating and sharing in ideas. It what makes you wonder how many other Bondarchuks existed or exist within the jumps, or whose knowledge just never left those systems. And we have some Cuban coaches here, and I work with some athletes who grew up in Cuba, and obviously they're really influenced by Eastern Bloc methodology. And I've learned some specifics about their program as well, which I think I've used a lot more this year. Like they have in their jump system, they basically have like 3 phases of jumps. It's called like salto A, B, and C. And in C, they accumulate like 800 contacts in a single session, and they're doing this multiple times a week. And then they'll go on to like salto B, which is the intensity ramps up. So they're still really doing, high volumes of around like 500 to 600 contacts, but also intensity is high as well. And then in the pre-comp, where they start doing like approach work from like 3, 5, 7 steps, they'll still have like 150 contacts. So, context matters. All these contacts are not maximal, and they're on a variety of surfaces, and they start accumulating this from a very young age. But I think it raises an important question of how many modern jumpers are actually, physically prepared to tolerate that level of jumping. So I think that's where my, I guess, coaching education has gone in terms of, very typical, very early on, and has some really good mentors that can help me dial in some of the real specific stuff. But I think we've also probably swung too far along and forgot some of the, the stuff that's out there from, different parts of history that maybe haven't been translated or just disseminated enough in the English speaking coaching world.
Yeah, it kind of goes back to our early point of view, which was like, are these types of athletes, and we'll take Cuban for example, are they purely genetic? Because we can see a trend across how the Cubans triple jump and long jump, like they're extremely elastic, and no doubt there isn't a genetic component to it. But when you mention things like they're doing 800 contacts in the GPP phase, which, probably is extensive. Is that correct to say? Like it's very small rudimentary plyos and things like that?
Yeah, but they're still doing them they're not just doing them on sand, they're doing them on grass, they're doing them
Yeah.
on concrete as well. Like, but yeah, they're rudimentary, but that's, it's still a huge number of
Yeah,
contacts.
yeah, no, it is. And I guess what I'm saying is like that shows that, they're developing the types of athletes they want through the correct stimulus. And I guess something to kind of jump on there is when, let's say, one is prescribing that type of emphasis in the training, the 800 contacts and whatnot, like how is that mix and match with everything else? Because I could imagine that that's not done in traditional linear periodization, in the sense that, you know, um, the running volume alongside that is very high as well. That's something that I've only, realized through doing my ACL rehab actually, is that, block periodization can be a very effective way to load one specific quality, and the return that you get is very interesting. Like, because actually for my ACL rehab, I've had a phase like that where I probably didn't do 800 contacts, but I couldn't run, but yet I was doing a lot of ankle based stuff, and doing that for 2 months odd, and then going back into running, I was surprised with the transfer. Like I really was surprised. So I'm very interested to hear more about how that all plays out within the program a little bit.
Yeah, I think there's always been an issue people have had with the Cuban philosophy. Like they don't run really much at all, as far as I'm aware, and they don't bring that in until later in the training, and they're not inherently fast on the runway, as you know. But I think if I take an example of my training, I had a similar injury where I couldn't do any sprinting, and I did a ton of plyometric work, and my max velocity numbers were higher than they were coming out of that. And that's probably because I was an elastic athlete, and that's not going to work for everyone. I think, specifically like girls I've worked with, you just can't get away with that. They need to do a larger volume of running and lifting. And the Cubans are lifting a lot as well, and they're lifting very heavy from a pretty young age as well. So I think they're really pushing the jump and lifting side of it, whereas the running they're probably neglecting a bit. Um, and I think maybe, if you look at the most successful coaches in the past 5 major champs, those who've had the most finalists, I think it's Pedroso and Pomaski, the Bulgarian Greek guy. And, they're both coming from those Eastern influenced. And I don't know the specifics of what they're doing, but I'd love to have like guests like that on your podcast and kind of figure that out. We had Betanzos, who was, an elite Cuban jumper who's now working in India. He came and spoke to us a bit, and he said he's learned a lot from being in a more Western based training setup where he's doing a lot more running, he's doing a lot less volume of jumping, and it's helped kind of him understand where that Cuban philosophy fits. And the same way with me, it's like, no way am I doing that amount of contacts, but I'm probably doing more and accumulating more than I did before, because we can get on to talking some specifics about the triple jump, but I think the triple jump's a pretty unique event where it's not just about is your talent is can you jump far? It's can you jump far and not break down? I think that's where maybe some of the Cuban stuff has becomes a lot more important to be able to handle the nature of the triple jump.
Mm. And I suppose with that, like when you're trying to approach a general prep phase and accumulate a lot of contacts, there's also the things that you tend to do within those, because you want to include technical development too. You know what I mean? Like you want to probably get that going from early in the season. So if I may ask, how do you, I suppose, marry the two? Is in the general prep phases, like, is there a way where you kind of can address, we're doing a plyo circuit here, which is kind of maybe very straight-legged base, but then once a week I'm also doing something that's addressing the bounding qualities, because I think sometimes, at least in coaching circles I've been in, it's like bounding is seen as a specific task that really isn't often stripped back, but in reality, like, can be modified in all sorts of ways to learn technique, but then simultaneously be low intensity, if that makes sense. So I'm interested to just know how you kind of marry some of that more like physiological driven stuff with perhaps also the technical stuff in the realm of plyometrics in the GPP, if that makes sense.
Yeah, for sure. Like I'm always teaching, and I'll never just do jumps for the sake of doing jumps. Like even the most lower intensity rudimentary jumps, foot contact. Can you place your foot on the ground with a flat foot? And when I'm doing those early bounding and hopping, we're doing it very vertical in nature. So with the bounding, we're thinking about our swing segments. Are we trying to swing from the knee or ankle? For me, I like the concept of swinging from the ankle or the shin, because I think if you swing from the knee, you tend to lose control of that shank and it can kind of tuck in or reach out. And then for the hop, can you extend the free leg, and can you bring the takeoff leg forward into a parallel position? Like all those things, even if we're on sand, I'm putting cones out. I think we start at like five of my feet spacing, so it's probably like just a little under 2 meters, and then so we start hopping and bounding with those spacings, and I'm teaching foot contact pattern and focusing on swing segments. And then as we progress that out, I might do 10 contacts in a set, and I'll do 4 sets of hops, 4 sets of bounds, 4 sets of hop steps. I'll do some more ball of the foot jumping, some pogo type jumping, and then maybe some more like deeper stuff for the hip, your typical like deeper type jumping. And that's some of that is just about developing capacities, but also the bounding stuff, and it's pretty intentional. Like I'm being pretty strict on the athletes with how they execute it.
Mm. And would you say the full range of motion stuff or the slow stretch shortening cycle stuff is more of a physiological thing, or do you think it also is very essential to address early in the year for technical development as well?
Yeah, I think because jumpers never don't rely on those deeper explosive strength capabilities as much as maybe sprinters. For me, probably it's more of a physiology, capacity building kind of thing, and less of a technical thing. But I'm still, you're still being pretty strict with it in terms of how you land on the ground. Everything is, I think how you land on the ground and your ability to distribute forces is probably the most important thing for triple jump. If you can't land properly, you've got no chance of um, absorbing and reapplying force in the direction you want.
Mm. And so we're probably discussing what seems to be a more of a general prep phase there. Do you start to discard those types of, fuller range of motion stuffs pretty early? And I suppose how does the things that you talked about there tend to progress from, a technical and physiological standpoint?
I think the submaximal jumps are important the same way submaximal running is, or submaximal lifting is in the gym. Your assistance work, it balances out the system you're trying to focus on. So it's like, you have your high days and low days, your high intensity, your low intensity, and you're sprinting fast, you're running tempo, you're lifting heavy, you're doing assistance work, and you're jumping with high intensity, but you're also jumping submaximally but we'll do that more in like a rudimentary jump type. So your typical rudiment jump circuit, we might do all year round, and take that deeper stuff out, because I think we can get that in the gym with like different lunge variations. But I think it's always important to balance high intensity with the low intensity work. And I think polarization of your program for any event is particularly important. Even in talking about endurance or throws, they're always doing high intensity and low intensity stuff in the most successful programs. And in terms of the jump stuff, like we'll start on sand, and I think building a base of those jumps on sand and softer surfaces we'll probably do that for about a month, and then we'll go to the grass. And this probably a mistake I made this year was not all grass is created equally, and some grass is really hard and some grass is really soft. So I think you have to be aware of that. And we have some turf here, which has actually been pretty helpful in creating a bridge between sand and track, and then probably spend about a month on grass, decrease some of those volumes and slightly increase some of those intensities. So we'll extend that out. So instead of maybe 4 or 5 feet in between, that's going to like 7 and 8. So it's probably getting closer to horizontal, but it's still vertical. It still gives us that time in the air to really focus on the swinging segments. And then we'll move to the track, and then we'll start increasing the number of steps, going from 3 to 5 to 7. And then right before the competition phase, I'll probably want to get to about having a few weeks of maybe in the triple jump, having, probably 8 to 12 step approaches, doing different variations of, hop, hop, step, jump, step, hop, step, jump. And some athletes who actually just need to triple jump. Some athletes I won't triple jump at all. Some athletes will only do triple jump because they just need that coordination and timing element, or they can't compete. So it's really just focusing on that part of what they need technically. Do they need to work on their hop? Do they need to work on the hop to step transition? Do they need to work on the whole jump? And it's just kind of identifying what they need at that point in time.
Yeah, that's actually a really good point there. So is it safe to say that as you get closer to the more specific work, that it actually tends to become more individualized in that, bounding skills early, heavy technical emphasis for everybody, everyone's going to cover somewhat of the same stuff and get those skills down. But then it's a case of case by case basis of you're going to go hop, step combo because you have a trouble with, recycling the hop leg, so on and so forth.
Yeah, absolutely. And it can also be a health thing as well. Like we can still, like if one of the guys has got a bruised heel or some ankle impingement stuff, we'll just do stuff on one leg, but we can still get a really high load through the system. We can still go off, 6, 8, 10 steps and we can take off on the leg that's maybe has those issues and land on the leg that doesn't have those issues. So we're still getting really high forces through the spine. So it's like a technical thing, a health thing, which marries up pretty well.
Yeah, it's interesting. One of the first kind of examples I can think of someone not really being married to the idea of doing short approach triple jump was Aaron Gadson talking about, the hop hop step combo being his pretty much go-to from 6 steps. And I completely see why, especially when you're trying to address things like free leg positioning, um, especially when you're getting to a point where 10 to 12 step jumps, it's pretty hard to address very fine technical details in terms of in-air mechanics. And so, the more opportunities through those likes of combinations from a shorter run can give you the intensity you want because by the time you get to the fourth contact, you're actually moving pretty fast. However, you've got ample opportunities to kind of, tweak through the actual execution of the task itself.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, I think you can, if you know how to take off, if you know how to bound and hop, like that is the triple jump. And if you have those skill sets and you can manage your swing segments, I don't really think it matters too much on the specific drills you do, as long as you're ready enough to compete from a preparation perspective and you've exposed yourself to those high forces and you know how to hop and bound and take off. And I think we didn't really talk about the takeoff itself. Like we'll do a lot of run jumps, repeated takeoffs, and for me, maybe that's where I approach the triple jump a little bit different to some other coaches. I think um, for the approach, you have a lot of technical similarities with sprinting and the long jump in terms of acceleration and transition. But I think the key difference is in the attack phase, which is more horizontally orientated. In the long jump, the center of mass tends to oscillate more vertically and bounce to the board. And you're trying to, because you're trying to create a larger vertical takeoff angle. But in the triple jump, it's a lot flatter and takeoff angles are lower. So I think something we do that's a little bit different is like we're using the 1080 quite a lot, doing approaches in the specific and pre-comp phase because that slight horizontal pull gives the athlete the sensation of being able to project more horizontally and feel like themselves running through the board. And I think that's one of the key skills for the triple jump is can you maintain your spatiotemporal characteristics and attack through the board without over manipulating your center of mass.
Mm. Yeah, that is very interesting. So I guess with the run jumps and the gallops, as they're often called by other people, you're probably going for a flatter trajectory with those, with emphasizing the execution.
Absolutely. And I think the long jump, the approach is for horizontal, the takeoff is for vertical. With the triple jump, the approach and the takeoff is horizontal, and the vertical emphasis starts becoming from the transition from the hop to the step. Up until that point, it's all horizontal.
Hmm.
And even like some of those drills you mentioned, we'll do that with horizontal loading as well, either 1080 or sled, just to really emphasize that pushing and leaving the foot behind the center of mass.
Hmm. Yeah, that's really important. I definitely have found that. But what I have found with that is, and I'm interested to get your thought, and this isn't something I prepared to ask, but I'm sure you have a good thought on it, which is the more you push that takeoff leg behind you, so in other words, there's more displacement, you're leaving it on the board for longer. It nearly seems to me that that's when you need to also have a good free leg to counterbalance it. In other words, if you want someone to get more out of that takeoff, you have to have a free leg that's going to allow you to stay upright in the air. Um, and if it's bent and it's tucked, as you displace better, that's not a great strategy for battling over rotation. I don't know if you agree with that or if you found that to be the case yourself, but that's just something in my own practice that like I might want you to improve your displacing or takeoff, but concurrently you also need to improve your free leg or else you're not even going to be able to finish that hop.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I totally agree. That free leg extending effectively, I think I mentioned it before. That's one of the big things for me. And it's something when you get new triple jumpers, it's hard to teach and it's one of the
Mm,
most important things to teach. And the way we talk about front side and backside in sprinting, you still have the same thing. Like one jumper at the moment I'm battling with, he kind of does what you're talking about and leaves it too far behind. And instead of the knee flexing and the hip flexing together, he'll flex the knee first. So there's almost backside in the hop phase, and then he won't recover it in front of the body. So he's
mm,
not prepared for the landing and the collision.
mm. Yeah, I actually had a master's at recently, which was the opposite of the example I'm explaining, where, I didn't have to teach him to displace at all. He was displacing extremely well, but as you say, because he was spending so long out the back, he never got around the front. So then you actually then just have a really sloppy hop contact for a different
Mm.
reason. But that is interesting. Another thing that I don't necessarily see a lot talked about, um, at least I think in America it is a bit more prevalent, and that is the role of pelvic posture in the run, and the influence it has on actual jump performance. Personally, I think if someone isn't running in with good pelvic posture, like the hop, step, and jump becomes extremely difficult.
Yeah, we do a lot of work on lumbo-pelvic stability. We do a lot of like just generic glute and core circuits. I think that's also been something that's helped a lot this year with one, lower back health, and two, controlling that. Like I previously got a lot of SI injuries because, like you said, the pelvis wasn't probably working optimally, and training that stuff and having a primarily focus on that stuff is really important, not just for health but performance as well. Like if your pelvis is tucked and you're leaving it behind, you're not going to control the swing segments and your trunk postures and your other swinging segments as much as you like to.
Do you address that from a technical standpoint as well? I suppose you do, but maybe not just on the runway, but off the runway. Like, and maybe a better question is, how do you do so? Like, what are some of the technical cues or strategies that you're like, this will set the pelvis in a better position if you do that? I'm obviously making presumptions there.
Yeah, no, I don't actually. I just have a pretty polarized in terms of I'll teach with the pelvis when I'm doing my hopping and bounding progressions. I'll be really strict with that, and same way with running drills and upright running. Be really strict with how the pelvis um, is functioning, and then I won't try and like have a middle ground. I'll just do my lumbo-pelvic stability circuits. You know, your typical glute med, glute stability stuff, core stuff, and then I've just found that stuff they'll have the capacities in place and it marries up nicely. So when I'm asking for those positions in jumping and sprinting, they can find them.
Mm. And would you ever do like the likes of hip lock stuff to help with that, or do you find that that's useful?
No, I don't do any of that stuff.
Okay, okay. Yeah, it's not for everyone. It's not
No,
implemented by everybody, I should say.
and
That's
I
interesting.
know a lot of really successful programs that use that and do it well and really believe in it. But just for me, I've tried it, but I've just not had much value from it, to be honest.
Hmm. Probably more on the, I suppose, coaching side of things within triple jump. I'm interested to know like some of the ways in which you solve like technical problems in the actual event itself. So, I created a few scenarios that I wrote down for you, and I suppose it's just something that I kind of came up with based off like seeing coaches coach different ways, and I'm interested to see how you would solve your way through a problem such as this. Like, so, you know, you've seen nothing else other than this, but let's just say that your last glimpse of an athlete is their feet touching the sand very, very prematurely by the looks of how their hips travel way past the actual feet marks. And, you know, um, yeah, they've essentially, like, you could say over rotated. But I'm interested to know, in your mind, given that you've seen nothing else, like what would be a leading factor for you in terms of addressing an issue such as that? So an over rotated landing, you could basically say.
Sure, I think um, the first thing I probably look at is when the athlete lands, as you described, like, is it a landing problem or is it, like you said, coming from an issue that was created earlier in the jump through, most of the time it is excessive forward rotation, and that's generated in the penultimate and the takeoff phases rather than in the air itself. And, athletes may over lower during the penultimate or reach too far in front of the center of mass or actually project too vertically, which you see a bit in quite young kids who just run through the board in the long jump. And then that will force them into an excessive rotation during flight. And, you hear a lot of coaches talk about blocking, and I think blocking is probably one of the most misunderstood concepts in jumps coaching and can actually contribute to over rotation. People talk about blocking harder as if the athlete should violently stop themselves at takeoff. But I think if you overemphasize blocking, you create large braking forces and the angular momentum has to go somewhere. And then you see, as you described, the hips get left behind, the trunk pitches forward, and the athlete rotates and drops the feet early. And I think the best jumpers don't really block in a traditional sense. They redirect. The takeoff is, more about maintaining posture, preserving velocity, and creating an active vertical impulse without destroying the horizontal momentum aspect.
Mm. Yeah, I think that's something that like Randy himself describes very, very well, is like how those last few steps can be active, but also like not negating the fact that the penultimate is supposed to be relatively active, which is something that, oftentimes doesn't get talked about. And you can see in how his jumpers perform is that there's a very smooth transference between horizontal to vertical, but also intentional, if that makes sense. Because there's probably the other side of the spectrum where you're just running off it and you're getting nothing out of the takeoff. But he kind of has a good way of describing what might lead you to getting the best of both worlds, I suppose.
I think you can create vertical impulse pretty much by two methods. You can have a really strong takeoff leg. Like I think the biomechanics show that 66% of the vertical impulse is produced just during the deceleration part of the takeoff. So before you even transition to the concentric part. So it's effectively how much eccentric forces can you absorb in a short space of time.
Mm,
So can you be really strong there? And the other part of it is, can you manipulate your body segments to create a better or more effective vertical takeoff angle using things like Randy talks about, the push-pull plant and
hmm
maintaining horizontal velocity and setting up a takeoff angle that's better suited to maintaining that horizontal velocity.
mm,
And I think the best jumpers in the world probably they have both of them.
mm.
They're able to manipulate their body and they're just really freaking strong.
Yeah. The one person that I thought of when you mentioned that example or those examples is Miltos Tentoglu, is that he does both of those things really well. He's a parkour athlete historically who has obviously massive amounts of eccentric strength running and jumping across buildings, things like that. But then if you watch his strategy, like he has that kind of maybe deeper penultimate than most athletes. But again, when you think about the type of athlete that he is, referring back to that eccentric strength, perhaps that's the way that you leverage the types of attributes that he has. But that obviously can look different for other people.
And I think also when you're prescribing jumps and plyometrics for the long jump, like if so much of your vertical velocity is created before you even push off, like you want to think about how you train that. And a lot of people do depth drops and altitude landings, and the forces you get during them are quite insane, like over 10 times body weight, depending on the type of box you're jumping off. And I remember speaking to Kareem Street Thompson once. I think he jumped 860 something,
Hmm
and he was telling me about his training with Dan Paff that year, and he was just doing tons of hop and hold stuff and drop and hold stuff. And it's like, if we know how much of that force is created from just that absorption element, I think that's something that we could really harness in long jump training as well, and not just doing tons of horizontal bounding or depth jumps for the sake of it.
Mm. Do you do any of that your stuff yourself?
I think with sprinting, like KPI number one is speed, and yeah, KPI number two is can you absorb forces, and then yeah, of course, there's a part left of that where plyometrics are going to function and help add to that, but I won't do like a huge volume of horizontal bounding or depth
Hmm
jumps. I just haven't seen the transfer, to be
hmm
honest.
hmm hmm Yeah, I think a lot of sprint coaches have kind of came to that conclusion as well. But for long jump, would you think like the likes of altitude drops and things like that is like a solid foundation? And would you include that as a base towards what will be, the more eccentric to concentric transition thereafter, like a depth jump?
Yeah, I'll put heaps of that stuff in for a long jumper, and I think previously with those kind of shock methods, depth jumps and altitude landings, whatever you want to call them, people only program them for like a very short space of time throughout the year, like because they think the intensity is so high that you can't get away with doing them for long periods. But like, if you think about short approach jumping and a triple jump, like when you start getting in the nature of 6 steps, 8 steps, the forces are going to be as high, if not way higher than that anyway, and you're doing that for months and months at a time.
Mm,
So I think you can get away with that stuff if you're doing it smart enough for long periods of time. And even in like, if you ever seen any of like Stefan Holm's training and the volumes of bounding and depth jumps and stuff he does, like you can get away with doing intense depth jumps or drop jumps for a long period of time, you just have to be, really careful of the managing fatigue and managing, I guess, joint stress and bone stress during those periods. But I think they're probably underused for longer periods.
Hmm. One thing I wanted to kind of turn back to on the scenario front was like how you manage steering problems. So, let's say hypothetically an athlete has fouled 1 to 3 centimeters in their last 4 or 5 competitions. They've all been big fouls. Let's say they're 40 centimeters, 50 centimeters ahead of their best marked jump from that competition. However, the problem keeps reoccurring, and ultimately they're frazzled by the idea of, currently thinking about the board. I'm wondering like how you would begin to manage that athlete, probe that kind of, I suppose, error. Because it seems like this is a very big topic of debate in terms of addressing steering. Don't think about the board, do think about the board. Is there a middle ground that kind of actually allows both to exist? You know what I mean? Especially in this specific context where, the athlete's clearly got a bit of a habit.
Yeah, I think in the long jump, you're never going to achieve those big jumps by slowing down dramatically to make the board. I think velocity is just too important. In the triple jump, maybe a little bit different. You do see some big jumps still with athletes jumping behind the board. But I think if an athlete is repeatedly fouling by like a couple of centimeters and their rhythm and posture is otherwise consistent, it suggests that the system's pretty stable, but the athlete is just maybe over calibrating towards performance and forgetting the precision element of long jumping, which is steering, as you said. And I think the way I approach steering is probably a little bit different. Like early on, I'll take the athlete to the board and I'll ask them where they want to take off from. Most athletes will put their foot right up against the foul line because psychologically they want to use all of the board. But then I'll immediately try and change that perception. I want them to feel like their takeoff is actually half on the white of the board and half on the red of the track. And that's a very different sensory target. And the surface feels very different underfoot, half rubber, half wood. And I think psychologically it changes their relationship with the board because a lot of fouling just comes from greed. The athlete is just chasing every last centimeter instead of trusting that, like we said in the long jump, velocity is the real performance determinant. And then from then, we'll do a huge amount of like walking takeoffs. I'll place the athlete different distances from the board, 5 meters, 6 meters, 10 meters, 15 meters, start with their right leg, start with their left leg. I'll have them walk in from random spots and just make sure they hit the board with the correct leg and mimic the takeoff action. And this is just essentially, it's like brain training. And steering is just your ability to make tiny step-by-step adjustments subconsciously. So the athlete arrives at the board on the correct takeoff foot and the correct takeoff place without disrupting rhythm or posture. And we'll also, add distractions. We'll have other athletes shouting at them during this walking drill, and it can become quite entertaining because, as you said, like in competition, a lot of fouling is also driven by doubt, fear, and
Mm-hmm.
over attention to the board. And I think it's important not to overcoach that conscious regulation, and elite jumpers will generally self-organize through optic flow and automatic stride adjustments. And if you make them stare at the board and consistently search for it, you destroy rhythm and velocity. So a lot of what we're trying to do is just improve the athlete's confidence at attacking the board at full speed, whilst exposing them to variable situations that force these subtle adjustments. And something else we'll use is like wicket runs, and we'll move the hurdles at random points or slightly alter the wicket spacing. So the athlete has to micro adjust the stride lengths at speed without consciously thinking about it. So usually with sprinters, I'm doing like 30 meters of hurdles, changing around 10 centimeters every third hurdle. But with this, I might change every fifth hurdle, or I might change up and change down, or I might take out hurdle 2, 6, and 9, and I'm just mixing it up so the athlete can consistently maintain their speed and posture with really subtle, constant adjustments. And ultimately, it's about the goal is to not teach the athletes to find the board consciously. It's teaching them to trust their rhythm, their velocity, and allow the perceptual motor systems to self-organize the task.
Mm. Yeah. So what you're getting at there is that you want to kind of promote the skill acquisition standpoint versus the promote the psychological standpoint, in that like it's not a psychological problem to be solved, but rather it's kind of, yeah, more skill acquisition, more coordination, and giving them varied stimuli to, I suppose, self-organize is a really, really important piece to developing what you want to see in competition. Is that right?
Yeah, I think that's where it starts. There's probably an element of both, but for me, if you can go through those progressions and start from those things and really get them to believe that that's the way we approach this concept of steering and the board, I think you have a lot more success with fouling.
Hmm. That's very interesting. Yeah, it's kind of, I suppose, it makes me think about a post that Jeremy Fisher recently put up on this. I don't know if you've seen it, but basically he was talking about, if I have it correctly, to, really run through the board, and wherever your foot lands, that is how much you move back your mark. And instead, when you're thinking about steering too much, you're kind of, I suppose, promoting like these kind of preppy mechanisms that you don't want to see in the jump. So his kind of number one is like, no matter what, you run through your board, run through the board with the natural stride length, and that is like the essential thing, because otherwise you've, as you said, lost horizontal velocity.
Yeah, that's something I'll emphasize massively in competitions. Anytime we do approach work in training or we go to a competition, I'll tell them the first run up, guys, I don't care where you take off from. I don't care if you're 5 meters behind or 5 meters in front. That is where we start from on that given day.
Mm,
I don't want you adjusting before the first one because it can be, we know how much wind can affect it or the athlete's shape or just how they're feeling on the day, or it might be a mistake they're making earlier in the run up. If they start chopping and changing in that attack phase, we can never really know where they're supposed to be
mm.
and what we need to change.
So when you said the first run there, are you talking about the warm-ups for the competition or the actual attempt?
Yeah, the warm ups for the
Okay.
competition.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I completely get that. I remember Jeremy saying it actually, now that I think about it. When I was up in Chula, I think Chris Bernard was jumping, and he came in and he kind of prepped the last few steps, and he was just like, look, I can't do nothing when you give me that. Like,
Exactly.
I can't tell you what we should do now, because I don't know what your natural stride would have looked like and where you would have been over the board. So it does make a lot of sense, especially when you are trying to like squeeze everything out of the approach, which is absolutely necessary. And as I was talking to you before we got on here, like, one of my own athletes like did well last week, but that was the reason. Um, the jump was 40 centimeters shorter than it should have been, because the last few steps were just dramatically shorter than the previous. And I think I myself could probably do a better job of like enforcing a system like that, which is good. Um, so thank you for that. It's great wisdom. I
No
suppose
worries.
it'd be it wouldn't be an episode conclusion without actually telling people more about where they can find yourself, Ross, as a relatively active Instagram user, and potentially other forums that I'm not so aware of. So please take some time to let the guests, or should I say audience, know exactly where we can find more of your work. And as you mentioned, you've done several other podcasts, and written pieces and things like that.
Yeah, for sure. I'm not hugely active, but Coach Ross Jeffs on Instagram, you'll find probably the most stuff. You'll see what our group's up to, and if I'm putting any content out or doing anything like this, it will be on there.
Awesome. Well, Ross, it's been an absolute joy to chat to you this morning. I mean, can't think of a better way to start Saturday morning to talk about jumps for an hour and a half. Um, really, really appreciate you coming on, man.
Awesome. Thanks for having me, mate.
This record button is